So this presentation is titled Beyond Content Types, a human-first model for tech talks. And the illustration you see here is based on a very famous painting you may know, which is called The Fourth Estate by an Italian painter. And really what it represents is like this drive to get things right, you could say, or at least more human-friendly. And I say human not as opposed to AI. I know that this is the hot topic today, but I say human as opposed to content types, which is abstractions, which are usually quite helpful, but also very dry and not really conducive to, I would say, achieving the goals we seek with technical documentation. Everyone who's present here today, I think, can agree that docs are great. Documentation is necessary. Perhaps 10 years, 15 years ago, that was a little different, but nowadays, I rarely see companies without a doc site or that don't try produce documentation. I think documentation is acknowledged as something necessary. The awareness is really higher than before, and pretty much every company will see this as a need. So this is good news for technical writers, especially in Europe, where the profession hasn't thrived as in the US. And you could say the craft is, despite the tech hiring freeze last year, is recovering. We are also trying to work with LLMs to create documentation. All that is great. That is great news. But what often happens when we approach the, when we start the quest of creating documentation is this moment where we stare at the blank screen, whatever our documentation system is. It could be BetterCode, it could be a CMS. And we stare at the screen and we ask ourselves, what documentation should we create? And why should we create that documentation? Like, what sort of, you could create, of course, we have a README file, but maybe we can go a little beyond that. Maybe we can create a tutorial. Maybe we can create a how-to, an FAQ, even though I despise FAQs. But if you feel curious about that, ask me a question later, I will tell you why. It's not easy to answer the question, which is very fundamental and is not that dissimilar to the question you would ask yourself if you were a writer of, like a fiction book, for example. There are, of course, there have been serious attempts at answering this question in a way that is very familiar to software developers, meaning frameworks, meaning templates, libraries that you can reuse. And here you have a couple examples. On the left side, you have the classic 4-quadrant model called the Ataxis, where you have, it's like very Cartesian, very nice, very perfect, like, just 4 content types in a square. There's no imperfection there, nothing, it's an even number. We have the tutorials, which are for learning, the how-to guides for the tasks, the explanations for understanding, and the reference, in case you need information. Nice, good. This model has been used several times. And on the right side, you have the Good Dogs project, which is an open source project for the community with lots of templates. And the templates are not really, you could consider them content types. They go a little beyond that in the sense that they're more like recipes you can apply, you can reuse in your documentation projects. And they have far more than just 4. But the problem that both of these approaches share is that they're not enough. They're not enough in the sense that their focus is mainly on the actions of the writers. They're mainly on what the writer should do, which is why they're so appealing to writers, right? Writers will just want to know, what they have to tackle, what they have to prepare. Of course, I will write a reference because the taxes say so, or I will use a template for how-tos from the Good Docs project. There you go. I mean, I just need to check the boxes, right? And that will ensure that my documentation is following a model. So, away with the imposter syndrome. But it's not really that simple, because along the way, we are forgetting about the actions of the users, which are the main consumers of the documentation. So the emphasis really in these models is on the what, what you are going to write, what we need in the repo, in the docs folder, instead of describing what needs to be addressed, which is what software does when you write a user story or you have a business requirement. But apparently, that's not applicable to docs, because docs are not treated usually as products. But I will come to this later. In the end, frameworks, what happens with frameworks is that they become like toolkits, like a chest of tools from which you pick, you select a few things here and there you want to use, and which is fine. It's an eclectic way of using whatever resources at your disposal. And developers in particular, especially when they don't have a technical writer around, they like using these frameworks because they offer like a very quick solution so that they don't have to think. Writers, on the other hand, I know many writers that appreciate these models, but they usually tend to discover that these models have shortcomings. They're too ideal. They are too, enclosed into the ivory tower, and they don't really describe all the corner cases, all that is needed in the end in the docs, especially when you have several stakeholders like marketing or engineering, product, etc. So here's a couple quotes. The first is from Michael Andrews, a very good content strategist. And he says, content types have become a bundle of fields rather than a clearly defined statement of intent. They're often overly abstract, tasks, concept, how to, etc., or too fuzzy, like how to. What's the how to? Such definitions don't tell us why someone needs the content. And I totally agree with Michael here. This is another quote from a content strategy conference a few years ago, 10 years ago. Pretending that a CMS will solve your content strategy problems is like thinking that a well-equipped kitchen will cook for you. But this is the fallacy where we fall when we start using and relying completely on frameworks. What comes first? What should come first? Well, everything should start with questioning the framework. Like you see the content types there, and you have to ask yourself, I've asked myself, like, which of these deal with solving user needs? Like, for example, I need to solve a problem. I need to understand whether this is for me. Which of these squares help users evaluate the product? Which of these serve the purpose of learning? And sometimes they answer these questions in a more or less weak way, and sometimes they evade the question. And you end up with the feeling that all of them can help user needs, or even just none of them. And maybe you're lacking content type, or you're lacking some kind of structure, some kind of guidance for your docs. So before Wolf introduced me, and he mentioned like this moment where when I realized this, well, essentially it was this mounting frustration with this state of affairs where the content types and the content frameworks weren't really addressing, in particular, my needs when creating documentation. And they were constantly being referred to as the sole resource out there for the question of what should we create. This in general is like more connected to a broader topic, which I might talk about one day, which is the fact that technical writing as a discipline as a depth issue, meaning that we have this problem where we are not really thinking deeply in general about a discipline, about what we do. We are not creating theories. We are not thinking in a philosophical way about what we're doing, and we should. We should, because the importance of what we do is very high. So in my case, what I decided was, well, what I thought was, we need to shift the focus. Let's be Copernican here. Let's shift the focus from the content types to the user needs. And this is something that our friends in UX design and UX writing have been doing before us in excellent ways. So why not applying similar principles also to technical writing? Why shifting the focus? Well, because to build effective documentation, and this is my belief here today, is that tools and content types, of course, can help, but you need a model, your own model of user needs that documentation must satisfy as a product. And I can't stress enough this part about as a product, because you have to treat documentation the same way you treat the product it documents, right? Or you need a model of the actions that the users need to accomplish through the docs. You have to aim for some kind of general model, right? Because the more general you can get, the more you can share it with other professionals, the more you can communicate with other professionals, so that it's, many technical writers have their own private mental model of what is needed. And I have mine too, and I'm going to share it today. But I think those models should be shared with the public, should be shared externally to allow technical writing, the technical writing community to engage in dialogue. Only that way, I think, we can find what the proper model is. I talked about model, and here, I guess that I don't know if you had lunch, you might be hungry right now. So let me present you the doc sandwich. It's just another way of explaining where a model like the one I'm going to present sits. So you have the bread, right? The bread is holding the sandwich together. And that's doc frameworks, it's content types, it's all the scaffolding, is the technical part, is the dry abstract part also that keeps things together. Now, without the filling, though, you just have red. The filling is the user needs, is really aiming for the juicy bits that the user require. So you need both things to do the sandwich. I'm not saying here that you don't need docs frameworks. I'm saying that docs frameworks are not enough. You need the frameworks, you need the tooling, but you also need a model of the user needs. And if you want the goals, the OKRs, what comes from the business, is like the sauce you put in it, right? It gives you the flavor if you want. But enough of metaphors now. And let me share the screenshot of one of my favorite video games, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I was thinking about the actions in all the adventure games were like words that you clicked in a menu. And those verbs allowed you to interact with the objects in the game. And I started with this screenshot playing, and thinking, if documentation was like a video game adventure from the 90s, what would the actions be? What Indiana would be able to do with all this documentation here? And the result is this heptagon, I think it's called. It's 7 sides, it's 7 actions. And I wanted to use the word action here because I think it's not reactive. It's not very proactive conceptually, and is just a model of what user actions the documentation are meant to satisfy, like what things the user want to do or are meant to do with the docs. What do they need to accomplish? So the user now is the main character. It has actions like in the video game, and it's using the documentation as a product. Now, this model here, it has, you can see there a number of actions. We have appraise, understand, explore, practice, remember, develop, troubleshoot. These all come from my experience as a technical writer. It's just my model, though. And I will return to this later, but this hasn't been validated through I'm a psychologist by training, so a psychologist creating like a personality test or a personality model would probably do like create a questionnaire and get like a sample of maybe 200 psychology students and validate the model internally and externally, etc. I haven't done that. I just wanted to share the model that I use. I want this to serve as inspiration. And the order here is intentional, meaning that I'm picturing a journey where you go from top to bottom, where you start from the actions at the top, like appraise, understand, explore. Then you deepen your journey through practice and recalling information. And then you end up eventually on day 2 solving issues with the product or extending the product. And it's important to notice here that even though this model uh, can be used for in domains that are not software, I'm a software technical writer. So, there might be a bias there towards software. But I think in general, these actions can be used for many other kinds of documentation, especially if it's publicly available. Oh, sorry. Now let's go with the first one. I call it appraise. And this one is, I call it understated selling in the note down there. This is very frequently neglected in documentation frameworks, perhaps because we have a story, technical writers, content strategies with marketing, and it usually is not a good story, meaning that we usually clash and there might be conflicts, there might be discussions, because marketing wants to sell and documentarians want to explain. So we may seem at odds or, just having conflicting priorities here. Let me just take a sip of water. So I wanted to start with this also for this reason, with this action, because I think is very it's like the forgotten goal of documentation, but it's a very important one. And you'll be hard pressed, not to find technical writers who at some point had to create documentation for this very reason. Sorry. Appraise is about addressing the needs of users who want to adopt the product, who might be potential customers. And why? Well, in the field of software, a product thrives if it's active, if their usage increases. So, in an old appliance manual, those printed manuals, maybe for a dishwasher, you would have, thank you for purchasing this AAG dishwasher series 8000. You will find this is an excellent product, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's not really appraisal, though it looks like appraisal. But in public documentation, which is the case of software, having something that explains what the product does and what the product is about and the promise of value can be immensely helpful for the product itself. We have a couple examples here. So this one is what is Databricks. And this page here is just an introduction about the product itself. You might argue that these could belong maybe to a marketing landing page or to databricks.com, but the thing is, many users just land on the documentation. Is the first place where they go because you can trust documentation. It's not gonna lie usually. It's not gonna sell you anything, openly. I will just tell you the truth, the facts. And this is where documentation like this helps them understand whether this is really for them. You have like a very high level diagram explaining what Databricks is for, what are the fields where it's useful. And the language, yes, is a little more marketing-y, you could say, but it's still objective. It is still telling you, this is the thing, and you might need the thing. These other documentation is the cloud service, Splunk Observability Cloud Service Description. I created this one at Splunk. Service description is a rather complex document. I had to work with 30 different stakeholders to create this doc, and it's very long. but it really is a key piece because it explains, the entire offering of the Splunk Observability Cloud product, including things that usually you don't get to see in other docs. Like, for example, what happens if I don't renew my subscription, or what regions is these available in, right? You could have that in the reference, you could have that in an FAQ, but to have a document that clearly addresses the need of, is this for me? Do I need this? And what is the shape of the thing before I buy it? I think is extremely useful. Second action is understand. And you can notice here that I put synonyms under each one, because of course I picked some words, but there are others that might help you also frame the action in a way that is more relatable for you. So it could be learn, comprehend, assemble, for example, in this case. Understand is a very basic initial action where you need to grasp the abstractions, the concepts that are key to the product usage. And this really depends on the complexity of the product. But in general, we're talking about docs that support, also classic product academy, some edu website where you have like webinars, or you have courses, or you have certifications. And these type of documents are very valuable because they sit at what I call the center of what I call the circles of product truth. And let me just introduce this one because it's also interesting. Is a way that I created 2 or 3 years ago to classify documentation and content types again, because again, this is not new. I was still frustrated back then with content types. And I thought, okay, so we have, concepts, conceptual doc, sample use cases, troubleshooting, reference. Where are these sitting? Where are these? Are we, how are they helping in deciphering what the product is, or what I call product truth? And the understanding part, the understanding user needs, is the same as asking yourself, why is the product behaving this way? Why do we need, if we're talking, for example, about Kubernetes, why do we need a control plane? Or what is a pod? What is a node? And you have examples, you have conceptual docs there sitting at the center. And when you get there, moving to the outer layers becomes easier, becomes simpler. An example of understanding documentation is, for example, Kubernetes components. Because really Kubernetes is an incredibly complex and abstract piece of software, where few things resemble things that are out there, in the world. And you need to understand many, to learn many pieces of vocabulary, new words, like, for example, the control plane, the cluster, the node, the pod. And if you go through the conceptual documentation, that will help you then navigate the rest of the docs when they tell you what to do with Kubernetes. Another example is thinking React, which is, again, a conceptual introduction with examples of React and the model by which React work through components, for example, and data flows. These two examples refer to very complex pieces of software, but that doesn't mean that simple software can't have this. I think any piece of software can have like a conceptual overview, for example, or documentation that address the need of understanding how things work. Next is explore, or discover, browse, try. This is interesting, is perhaps the most fun action, in the sense that you are essentially exploring. There comes a moment where users will sign up and will start trying things, and will start browsing the screens of your application, maybe on mobile or in the PC. And documentation can be a great partner there, in that they could maybe either integrating the product or outside of the product. They can provide instructions and affordances to facilitate this exploration activity. This is my favorite example. I don't know, I feel a bit old when I see this, when I stare at this picture. Is from Windows 3.11. I don't know if you, or 3.1. I don't know if you ever used that version of Windows back in the early 90s. But essentially, it had this, if you went to help in the program manager, it had this tutorial where it taught you the very basics of the Windows UI and using the mouse, which sometimes was as new as Windows for some users. And it's interactive. It plays almost like a game, perhaps a very boring game, but it plays almost like a game. But this is documentation. Make no mistake. This is not an app. This is not a game. These are docs. The same goes for a tour of Go, the Go programming language. It has this fantastic interactive tutorial where you get documentation on the left side with instructions, and on the right side, you have a sample program you can edit and run and just see how it works. So I think there are few things as effective as trying a programming language immediately to get a feeling. And similarly, React, again, I think is an excellent example of developer documentation, has this quick start where you have the code and you see the output immediately, and you can even edit it and see what the effect is. Then you have practice, right? This is more like phase 2. You have appraised the product. You have started understanding the concepts. You have explored. Now it's time to improve, to exercise, because you need to learn how to, you decided to purchase it maybe, or to, implement it at work. So you need how to operate most parts of it. And the interesting thing here is that the more you practice, the more you feel confident, and perhaps the more likely you are to become a product advocate. And this type of documentation, as I wrote here, is really the basis of sometimes of certification paths, because you really get solid knowledge of how the product works. A few examples here, like we have, for example, this very popular GitHub page. This is more procedural, right? You would probably map it to how-tos or tutorials, and we'll see that later. But this is like a very popular GitHub documentation tutorial where it teaches you how to generate a new SSH key. And it's so popular that people refer to this tutorial even when it's not about GitHub. They don't need to solve a GitHub problem, maybe, but they know this tutorial because it's so comprehensive and well done that is like the go-to reference for generating SSH keys. There's few documentation about it out there. This other one comes from MailChimp, the newsletter product, and it's about importing content. So you have the requirements. It's a classic tutorial, right? You learn about how to do something with the product. Hardly any mystery here. This one comes from Dynatrace. You have something more clearly day 2, like how to manage users. It's not about exploring. It's not about trying something new. I picked this example because it's about going more in depth of what the product does. So, user management. You then have remember or recall, retrieve, reference. This is similar to reference, of course, but this is really for remembrance, for having a place to get back to when you need to remember something about the documentation. And it's really like the evergreen value of the documentation comes from satisfying this user need. Is the bedrock of long-term product usability. Hardly no mystery here, but the 2 examples I picked are really great. For example, the Docker file. Docker has many docs like this for reference. And there are huge one-page documents with lots of headings, lots of sections. and you can just Control F and search for things here. And it's just great. It's just great because everything you need, the like classic reference manual, is here on a single page, and you can find pretty much everything. The same for GitLab. Again, a complex tool with lots of settings, lots of keywords and commands, and you want the same experience of browsing a reference to search what you're looking for. That's a need, and it's very easy to satisfy. You then have, now we're going to the third step, and we have develop and troubleshooting. Develop is about extending the solution in the broadest sense, like building something with it or building something on it or extending it. And developer documentation really turns the users into something else, into co-creators, and right here, co-authors, developers themselves, and it's the basis of an ecosystem. A good example is developer docs, of course. API docs is another good one, and it's a type of docs that is a foundation for communities of practice. Some example, we have Vercel. Vercel is the classic developer tool, and it has lots of documentation for to create integrations with Vercel. Like this is an approval checklist. Like, what do you need? It's very straightforward, like a tool chest for the developer. Or Chrome extensions is another example. Oops, sorry. This one is about how to debug extensions. So again, it's a problem that someone who wants to extend the product after going through all the previous steps will face at some point. Lastly, come troubleshoot or overcome, solve, stabilize. And I think you'll relate to this one. And this actually was the first action I thought of when I sat down to think about the actions, because it's the one that is like the glaring omission from most documentation frameworks. It's this one. Like, yeah, of course the user has to learn. Of course the user has to understand and maybe use the reference, but users very often are in need of solving problems. And I was like, how is it possible that the taxes and other models lack this? How is it possible that they're not addressing troubleshooting directly? Maybe I don't know, maybe it's ugly to acknowledge that your product might be broken or something might go wrong. Well, not really. I don't know why. I think that perhaps they were thinking again about, in terms of content types and templates, and they didn't have one in mind for troubleshooting. But again, it doesn't matter. It's what matters here is that you have content. It could be an FAQ even that addresses the need of solving problems, of diagnosing the issues. And I think that in this sense, the most effective troubleshooting is not just the quick solution, like maybe a snippet or something. Of course, that's useful, but even more useful is to teach users how to think about the system itself and how to solve problems. The classic proverb of this classic saying of, instead of fishing, teach how to fish. Well, most effective troubleshooting is teaching how to troubleshoot issues in your product. So here we have an example. The Kubernetes documentation could probably have thousands of docs about every single error they have, but they chose to follow a different path, which is teaching how to troubleshoot issues in general, because it's more practical, it's more effective. And this one is about how to debug pods, for example, and it provides like a series of steps and tips on to follow to diagnose a problem. Oh, sorry. And this one is from Elastic, the company I currently work for, where you have again, how to fix common issues by category. Then you dig deep into those and you find like more concrete recipes. Now, the 7-action model in practice. 1 second. How can we, all this sounds great. 7-action, addressing users' needs. How can we make these happen? Well, For one, you can start if you have the actions and you have like, it can be these, could be others. You can start by thinking how to map these to your favorite content framework or to your topic types you have built into your tool. Or maybe if you use data, for example, you can start thinking about how to map these to data. And this table here is like a suggestion. It could be different, of course, but it's a suggestion of how to do that. Like, for example, appraisal is something you could address by creating an overview or a service description. And the data elements, for example, are topic or concept. For understanding is very similar. You might have like a glossary entries, and what you want to create maybe is a conceptual guide. For explore, you can create a quick start, and some of these come from the Good Docs project, by the way, or tutorial for like the classic diataxis tutorial, or maybe you can be more interactive. You can create a sandbox or a lab, and you have, of course, tasks and steps to follow if you're in the data world. Practice maps very well to how-tos, user guides, again, to tutorials, and you see the overlap. The overlap happens in the real world of documentation, or meaning that first you go with the user need, and then eventually you might use the same topic types for more than a purpose. And that's perfectly normal. You don't have to have like a one-to-one mapping, even though it's cleaner and it's more platonic. But the word of documentation demands a more empirical approach. And for remember, again, you have the reference, command reference, glossaries, integration guides for development, and troubleshooting documentation for troubleshoot, or an error reference, right? Or even an optimization guide, because it's not always about things that break. It can always be about things you want to improve, like performance. So mapping is one of the first things you can do. How could this look like in a documentation set? Well, you could have a table of content where you explain a feature, and you have, for the feature, you have an overview that would satisfy appraise. You would have a quick start for the exploration, a conceptual overview of the concepts. Then you have a series of tutorials that will be practice. You would have a settings reference that will be remember, and a troubleshooting. And the same for feature 2 or 3. And this is simply a proposal. You could structure the documentation in a different way. And again, it wouldn't really matter. What matters is that you are covering the actions when it makes sense, in a way that makes sense for your users. Then, of course, you can, an interesting thing here is that you can connect the actions of your action model to the metrics, rather than, for example, you have the content types, fine. How do we measure the success of the content types? Well, you can focus maybe on the page views, satisfaction scores. Sure, but how does connecting the actions to KPI sound? For example, appraisal, given the purpose of appraisal, measuring it by the conversion rate from the documentation, like how many licenses, for example, people buy after checking the docs. Well, that's a very important metric for any business. Troubleshoot could be measured by time to resolution decreasing. Understand could be measured by the completion of learning paths in an academy. Explore, just browsing the application, trying things out. Maybe for a new feature, you could measure that through increasing user engagement or signups. And the develop dimension, maybe by the number of integrations that users have created. Or if you introduce a new, say, library or a new feature in your developed toolkit, in your SDK, you can measure through internal telemetry, the impact after you launch the docs. And you can already measure things more meaningfully because, again, you're targeting meaningful needs. So, and pardon me here, the German pun. My German is like, very few words, so I didn't feel confident now to present here, but embrace the handlungsorientiertes Dokumentation. I hope I pronounced that well. What I'm saying here is that you want documentation that is centered around actions. So it's not just about what you write, but what the users can achieve. And you can, you are allowed to challenge your current approach. Like, are you currently designing for that? And then again, I would broaden the question to the community and say, can we use this approach to improve, the practice collectively? Lastly, which might seem a contradiction here, but this is not about the 7-action documentation model. As I said before, this was meant as an example of the things you can do or the kind of model you can build. The purpose is, the idea that I would like you to get from this talk is that you can build your own model, or you probably have a model in your mind. You can use mine if you want. It doesn't matter, because what matters is that you put the content types and the tools and the metrics, which is the bread of the sandwich in the previous metaphor, at the service of your users' needs. So think like your users, design for their actions, what they want to do with the docs as a product, and that way you will get, hopefully, better documentation. Dankeschön.